Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by the economist and professor Richard Wolff, and I always look forward to speaking with you. So, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much. I enjoy your work, Glenn, and it's an honor to be part of it.
Thank you. Well, in this Russia-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, the focus is always on the military conflict, but it's also an economic war. Indeed, as we learned in the beginning of this, at least in 2022, the goal and the initial assumption was that the NATO countries could break the Russian economy relatively fast, that is isolated in the international system, put crippling sanctions, and some expected that this, could be done by the weekend almost. But obviously, this did not play out as expected. So I guess starting with a broad question before digging into the details, what was the economic strategy? I guess the assumptions it rested on, and why didn't it succeed?
Well, I think there were two at least issues that the Western world, which is Western Europe mostly, the EU and the United States, did not assess correctly. I don't think there's any amount of spinning that's going to erase a very clear sense that they underestimated the ability of the Russians to wage a conventional military war, and they overestimated the ability of economic sanctions to be a powerful weapon in the event that the military didn't work out. And they had, unfortunately, miscalculated on both counts. They underestimated the Russian military potential, and they overestimated the impact sanctions can have, and so they've lost the war. And they find it virtually impossible, well, not virtually, they find it impossible to recognize this misjudgment. When people go into war, they should know that wars have a nasty tendency to have outcomes that were not expected, to have failed to take into account one or another resource on either side. And therefore, one of the reasons you don't have a war, besides all of the obvious political, moral, physical costs, is the uncertainty. And it is a terrible mistake not to give to uncertainty the respect it ought to have. And nothing illustrates that better than what we see now. The Russians are a much larger country than Ukrainians, so there's an obvious advantage in manpower that the Russians bring to such a conflict. That should have slowed people down, but nowadays, when we spy on one another with satellites and so on, to misunderstand that the Russians have more missiles and have more drone capability, and even if they didn't have it in February of 2022, they have the capacity to enlarge their production. And that's well known, or should have been well known. And that made the whole military thing dubious. And they understood that because really from the beginning, the Europeans and the Americans were willing and able to keep increasing the quality and the quantity of military support. Remember, early in the war, they weren't going to get big tanks. They got them. They weren't going to get F-16s. They got them. They weren't going to get this or that missile capability. They got it. It was raised each time without admitting that obviously you had thought they would not be necessary because you're providing them ex post after the war is well underway, after you had your chance back in March and April of 2022 to reach a negotiated settlement. the famous meetings in Istanbul and so forth. So I think they systematically underestimated Russia's military capability. And likewise, then they misunderstood the sanctions. And there's two things to say about that. Number one, there's a long history of sanctions, maybe not as big as the ones the Europeans imposed on Russia, maybe not as overwhelming as having both the United States and the Europeans impose sanctions. On the other hand, the history of sanctions is mostly a history of failure. And that's documented. There are books, I've read them. There are articles, I've read them, about sanctions, asking the logical question, did the sanction achieve the objective that was stated for it? And there's a pretty strong consensus that sanctions may be a burden, sanctions may entail some costs for their objects, but they very rarely achieve anything like a decisive outcome. And that makes me wonder why this extraordinary confidence in the West that these sanctions would have the effect. You know, I follow the situation of the little country of Cuba. It had 8 million people when the sanctions began. It has, I think, 11 or 12 million people today. It has been a systematic, devastating sanction for Cuba. Cuba has paid all kinds of costs of being the object of sanctions. I don't deny that for a moment. But the obvious reality is, despite the political isolation and despite the sanctions, Cuba is as resolute an opponent of the United States today in every way as it ever was, you know, during the time of Fidel Castro and since his death. It did not work. It didn't produce regime change. It didn't change the economic system, none of it. And, you know, it's pathetic that it would be continued this long against a little country. But perhaps the most important thing for us to talk about now is a different issue, which I would like to bring to the fore, because I think it touches many other burning issues. We live in a different world economy. It is radically different from what it was 20 years ago, and even more different from what it was in the second half of the 20th century. At that time, the United States dominated the flows of capital, the exports in the world, the imports in the world, the loans. I mean, it didn't matter. The dollar was the sovereign global currency, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is no longer true. And nothing has replaced it in the West. There has been something that has risen while the economic importance of the United States and its allies in Western Europe, the G7, if you want to think of it that way, that decline of the G7 has not stopped. It's continuing as I speak to you, and the rise of an alternative continues to be as badly underestimated as was the military capability of Russia and the overestimate of the sanctions. And I'm talking about China and the BRICS. What Russia did was turn to China and the BRICS. Russia, remember, is a founding member of the BRICS and an important part of it, heaven knows. And they turned to their partners, above all China and India and Indonesia and others, and they turned to them for extraordinary help in offsetting both their military problems and the sanctions. And from everything I can tell, sitting here in New York as an American, the strategic planning under both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump did not acknowledge, did not count on, did not foresee what the BRICS could bring to the Russians in this time around military and sanctions. And if you can't sell oil and gas, if it's a crucial export, as it is for Russia, if you can't sell it to Western Europe, but you can sell it to India, China, Indonesia, what's the power of the sanctions? I mean, it makes no sense at all. You can't do it. And I think you're watching the slow, and I am stunned by just how slow it is. It wasn't that long ago that Mr. Trump gave a news conference and a reporter asked a question about the BRICS, and he dismissed it. That's not an important matter. Well, all I can tell you is, as a professional economist looking at the world as I have been doing all my life, it's about the most important thing I can think of in terms of changing the economic conditions. And here's my final point. We could talk about sanctions, and I can tell you in detail how the BRICS helped, but it might be even more important for people to understand that the effectivity in terms of the war in Ukraine that was misunderstood, the effectivity of the BRICS, is now being similarly misunderstood, because the BRICS is going to have an enormous impact on whether the tariff program of Mr. Trump ends up being good for the United States or a disaster for the United States, in the way that the Ukraine war has been acknowledged as a disaster by Mr. Trump himself. I mean, he explains the disaster differently, he blames differently, but it is a disaster. He says so. Most of the rest of the world admits it. The Western Europeans are becoming daily more depressed, more isolated, and more slowly arriving at the same conclusion. They don't want to admit it, but it is fairly obvious. But again, the BRICS is the change. And I don't mean to take away from China. I mean, China is obviously the center of what the BRICS represent. But it's very important that the Chinese have a growing, strong alliance, 9 or 10 partners and another dozen affiliates, or whatever they exactly call them. You are seeing them prepared for the kind of turn to nationalist economics that nobody else is prepared. Europe is divided and woefully unable to deal with the new world economy, and the United States ditto. The actions, therefore, are desperate, like a tariff on everybody. But the irony is, the best positioned to handle that is China and the BRICS. It's extraordinary what we are watching unfold, and it leads all kinds of people, not just, a few like me. I am, in this case, not at all. I wouldn't mind if I were the only one, but I am not at all. And you know that. You've interviewed Yanis Varoufakis will explain the same thing from a different angle. He focuses a bit more on the dollar and all of those issues. But he's quite interesting and quite right. But he's one of many who are slowly in his case, not so slowly, but he has a unique experience because of being the finance minister in Greece and his long history of writing about these issues.
I remember Trump, he said, regarding the de-dollarization, I threatened 100% on BRICS, so BRICS is finished. And this dismissive approach of opponents, I think this is a real weakness, not just of the United States, but the Europeans as well. And, they say that, everyone expected Russia to break, but that's not really true. It's because they censored all dissent. I mean, me personally, this is the only thing I was working on since 2014 almost. This is Russia's economic reorganizations to the east under this Greater Eurasia Initiative. And again, I told everyone here, you should, if you want to understand what the Russians as well as the Chinese are doing, you should read Hamilton, you should read Friedrich List, you should read Sergei Witte. This is where these are the ideas that are being followed now. And essentially, you're shut down. You say, well, you're trying to delegitimize the sanctions. You're suggesting they don't work, so we won't follow. And, so the Europeans especially went into this, being very blind, deaf, and dumb. Or as our friend Varoufakis say, the stupid continent. And I think this is a huge problem. But again, I think my point is that the assumption that the Russians would simply try to wait this one out, it fails to recognize what they're trying to do here, which is this merely intensified what they've done over the past at least 8+ years, which was to transition away from this American model and towards this multipolar economic infrastructure. But you did say that, you could say how BRICS helped the Russians skirt the sanctions. How did you assess this? Because again, I know it goes across many spheres, but what do you look at specifically?
Well, for me, this is an attempt to shut. In the United States, there is I forget who said it, but some nasty fellow referred to Russia as a gas station trying to function as a country, or something clever.
McCain, yeah.
Yeah.
Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country. I always said that Russia's a civilization masquerading as a country, but fair enough.
Yeah. And so we have been taught that it is customary to believe about Russia that something went terribly wrong there in 1917, that the trauma of World War I, the trauma that Russia lost that war, plunged it into a mistaken direction, led by Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all of that. They made an experiment. It lasted 60 to 70 years. And then the intrinsic unworkability of the socialist model brought it to an end in 1989, 1990. And that ushered in the great unipolar moment for the United States to kind of take over the position it had already held in many ways since the end of World War II, to dominate the world totally, since the Soviet Union had been the only obstacle to all of that. And we were told, basically, we were taught, including by the professors who specialized in the Soviet Union and Russia and all of that, because during the Cold War, for example, in my education, and I'm a product of the elite schools of the United States. I went to Harvard and Stanford and Yale. That's my education. 10 years in that silly sequence of institutions. But I had the professors who were really well known in this area, and they explained that it was 30 years since that, 1990, and that Russia has had to undo all of the mistakes that the Soviet Union represented. And so it had become, a backward country that exported its agriculture, its mining, and its minerals, its whatever was under the ground as so much raw material for others then to use. And the energy story fit into that. We were shown how big a share of GDP oil and gas were, all of that. It meant that you understood the Soviet Union as wildly lopsided in its industrial development and wildly dependent on exports. And neither of those things is particularly true. They are not just exaggerations, but they misconstrue what Russia was trying to do. They made the same mistake in China. I mean, they recognized China went further, but China too was seen as a lopsided, underdeveloped, socialistically mismanaged, export-dependent country. And therefore, these people should be easily defeated, especially in a war of attrition, and should also be easily suffocated by shutting off the exports upon which they depended in different ways, but they both depended. And the United States was in the ideal position because they depended on exporting there mostly and to Western Europe secondarily. So this was an image that was incorrect, had more to do with the second half of the 20th century than it did with what has happened since that time. And each day it becomes more and more of a caricature that meant that the logic of the sanctions wouldn't work. That what you would see is what we have in fact now seen, that the exports would be shifted somewhere else. The imports that the exports paid for would now be paid for because they'd be drawn from other parts of the world and paid for by exports to those other parts of the world. And finally, those other parts of the world, whether we're talking grain export or fertilizer export or oil and gas export, there's enough of them. They are big enough and rich enough now to be able to handle the adjustment that the Russians are making. And as you rightly say, these were already things underway. They didn't have to be started from scratch. And so what this has done is accelerated a process that's already there. And one last point on this. It is surprising in a way that the United States would continue to say, as Mr. Trump says even over the last 2 days, that the war is a negative experience for the Russians economically. It's strange for the United States because our history in the last century was a history in which going to war in World War II is what we overcame the Great Depression. The going to war wasn't a damaging experience in the 1940s. It was an economic boost. The rate of growth, GDP, soared. The mass of people unemployed were put to work. Half of them in the military, the other half producing the equipment the military used. And something like that is what happened in Russia. They got a stimulus out of this war, which is part of why the ruble didn't collapse and the depression didn't descend on Russia. None of it. None of it. And I'm not saying that the Russian economy doesn't have problems. It does. Or that the BRICS don't have problems. They do. Or that the BRICS aren't very heterogeneous. They are. All of that is true, but it doesn't change that going to war against Russia and sanctioning Russia are projects for which the changes in the world economy have made them ineffective.
Regarding the Yeah, the way they look at Russia, but also the Chinese for that sake. It's often said in the military that the generals always fight the previous war, but it's also true with the economic warfare. I've heard people who met and know the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, who said that his views, for example, on China was they're a communist country. They don't do economics well. They don't innovate, they steal, and kind of they lean into this ideological stereotypes from the 20th century, looking at the Soviet Union. But of course, you can say that China is very, very different from what the Soviet Union ever was. Indeed, their ability to innovate and all. But of course, Russia is no China now. They're much smaller in every way. But the extent to which they're able to develop a lot of technological sovereignty, their own digital ecosystems, diversify, not just rely on the physical corridors facilitated by the Chinese and the Belt and Road, but have their own, the financial diversification with the banks and payment systems and all of this. This is quite significant, and the fact, as you said, that they couldn't have done this alone, but they're not pursuing a Russian hegemonic Eurasia. They know that they need to work and harmonize their interest with the other major actors, so China and India and all of the others. So it's just, I think, again, it's always this tendency, I think, to underestimate the other side, especially when you lean heavily into this, ideological stereotypes. But what do you think went, focusing on one specific issue on the sanctions? Because in Europe, we took a heavy blow to our economies by cutting ourselves off Russian oil and gas. The idea was that, this would be the silver bullet. This would, destroy the Russian economy. Of course, there's other aspects too. But what do you think went wrong on the energy? Why couldn't we predict the Russians' ability to diversify?
Yeah, I do think it's very heavily dependent here on ideology, because we're talking about calculations. No one can see the future, so the people in the Pentagon and the people in Washington are like we are, trying to figure out, in some sense, what's going on, what are the risks, what are the shifts that we have to take into account as we go after our objective. If we put aside the objective for the moment, I ask myself, as you do, how do we account for such a miscalculation? In a way, it's an old question. How do we account for, whether it's Hitler or whether it's Napoleon, people who fight, win some, and then lose catastrophically? What happened? What is it that they obviously didn't do, because the outcome is the opposite of what they were trying to achieve? And I'm afraid, I wish this weren't true, that the United States is in a sense a victim of its own kind of inability to adjust to a changed world. Let me give you an idea of how it works, because it's going on right now. It's very, very important. I'm going to start with China. I have been interested in China since I was a graduate student in economics. I wrote my master's thesis on the Chinese communes and why did Mao do that early on after the revolution? Why did they not succeed? Why were they abandoned, and so forth? So I followed these issues all my career, for many decades now. And I never stopped being amazed at my professors. And because I went to the elite schools, my professors have been the economic advisors of most of the presidents, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obama. These are people that I know personally and who were my teachers in many cases and whose work I read. I cannot tell you how many times when I would ask a question about some economic development in China, I would be told by them that these statistics were not real, that unlike our statistics, which are gathered by objective measurement and all of that, the Chinese, being communists, and since I knew who communists were, I understood that this is a caricature, but it kept on going. After it became impossible to pretend that China hadn't economically developed pretty much along the lines of what they had claimed, I got the second level of argument. Well, yes, they have made some gains. And you know why that is? Because Deng Xiaoping opened China up to private capitalist enterprise, both Chinese and non-Chinese. Welcomed the West to come. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger made their famous trip in the 70s and opened China up. And so these very smart and clever communists brought in the capitalism without which they could not have had. And when I would point out how much of the statistical growth had been achieved before this transition, they just brushed it away. I was wasting their time. They knew what was done, and that the very growth of capitalism was the recognition by the Chinese Communist Party that its only future lay with an ever-increasing private capitalist sector eating up and being the beneficiary of the endless atrophy of the governmental run. The notion that you had a different system here, that you would have an economy that would be 50% private, 50% government, and that the government sector would invest in all the things that were judged to be necessary, but for which private profit wasn't a sufficient incentive, that this is another way of understanding how you allocate capital, and the result is an economic growth rate on average for 30 years, 2 to 3 times faster than what the United States can get, should settle the matter. And I'm explaining that to the people who taught me to think like that. And they don't know what to do when they hear it. And so they handle it as dismissible. It's not part of the conversation. And they are going to throw around the weight of the United States, in which they all grew up, as I did too, the second half of the 20th century, with America dominant. They don't think that's really been changed. They don't see it. They can't see it. And the result is they are making catastrophic misjudgments. And even which I've done, when you explain to them, here, you misunderstood what the BRICS can do. What does it mean that when Mr. Modi in India looks around the world, and heaven knows he's no communist, he's no Marxist, he has no interest in any of that. But when he looks around the world and assesses the risks and rewards that are available to him, he's very careful to buy every last drop of oil that the Russians need to send him, and to respond to Mr. Trump by saying, I can't do what you're asking me to do, and I'm not going to. And you're going to have to live with it. Or you can declare war on the whole world, but then you're crazier than the people who call you crazy now. And so I can't build my policy around that. And Xi Jinping is the same thing. And more leaders around the world are concluding that you cannot deal like this. You cannot. You're dealing with people whose grasp on their situation is so different from yours that it's a little bit like trying to get Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky to sit down and talk to each other. What's to discuss? They don't understand the world they live in a comparable way. At a certain point, when Russia finishes this job, which is the way it looks to me, of course I could be wrong, but that's the way it looks. When the troops are standing around Kiev or whatever it is, then there'll be a moment when their perspectives will converge, but not yet. And so they're prepared to go fight to the last Ukrainian, or nearly so. I'm afraid to tell you that Ukraine, as I think you said at the beginning of our conversation, it's the flashpoint. But it's the flashpoint not just because there's armed conflict going on there, but it's a flashpoint about a global shift, and it is irresolvable because the shift has not yet entered into the mental capability of at least one side in this game. And if I may, I don't mean to change the topic, but it's a little bit like looking at the Gaza story. You know, one side believes it's an existential threat that there exist people known as Palestinians. And how are you going to sit down with Hamas or any other representative of the Palestinians and have a conversation if that's your attitude? You know, it's like asking, I don't know, Hitler to sit down with the head of the Jewish community in Berlin and work out something. You can't, because the existence of one is the unacceptable to the other. And, you know, this, in the end, may be the most powerful argument that the Chinese will have to establish themselves as the global hegemon. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but it certainly is an idea that ought to occur to people, given the sequence of Dutch Empire, British Empire, American Empire, to wonder about the Chinese as probably the next one isn't bizarre. It's a reasonable question to interrogate. And I think the Chinese know it, and I think the rest of the world knows it, and becomes very odd for the United States to pretend that none of that is a reasonable basis for people to function. Then it becomes the United States that's bizarre, not these other countries, because they clearly understand how the Americans look at this. We are acting out a way of thinking about the world that they have witnessed anyway with us for the last 100 years. So they understand where this comes from, but they're living in another world, and they see which world is fading and which world is emerging. And this has to be faced sooner or later. But I can tell you better than I can about anything else that we're not at that point. I want to remind everyone, we just had a presidential election last November, not that long ago, in which the major candidates for president, Trump, Biden, and then Harris, none of them ever mentioned the declining empire of the United States. And none of them mentioned, to my knowledge, the BRICS or any basic shift. There was nothing to discuss about a changed world economy. That I find devastatingly powerful evidence that we have a very basic disconnect. And I think Mr. Trump is in the process of now discovering step by step that what he didn't calculate, all of what he will no doubt call unintended consequences, or what he'll blame on others, is that you can't declare a tariff against the rest of the world. Can't do that. That is too crazy. that is too overwhelming, that is got too many variables going in too many directions to get you any confidence in whatever prediction you make. I mean, in the last 24 hours, the largest automobile company in this country, General Motors, responded to the tariffs whose intended purpose is to increase production, industrial production in the United States, by explaining that they are decreasing it and increasing production of cars in Mexico. And von der Leyen calls up Mr. Trump, says we can't meet the extension on June of the tariff game to June 1. Please give us an extension. And he gives her an extension until July 9. I mean, what in the world is going on here? And the Europeans, and here maybe, I should interview you. In the case of the Europeans, the disarray, the inability to get any kind of solidarity going that I can identify, I find that unbelievable. It's just, how long are you going to go when the world is more and more the US and China, and Europe's relevance dissolves by the hour? I mean, it's just, is there nobody in a position to do anything about that? And are you all going to let the Germans rearm again? I find it amazing.
I think some of the strategic vacuum that exists both in the United States and Europe comes from the inability to, as you said, recognize the time we live in. So your example with the American presidential election, that there's an election, no one discusses the historical time we're living in, actually the decline of US empire, and now countries in the East and leading with China now taking over, being the key drivers of the global economy, that this has to be the central focus, because when you develop a strategy, you see the main trends, you see your resources, and how you can maximize your benefits within this context. But it's a bit problem even after the Cold War. This was a problem because we kept speaking of the post-Cold War era, which is a very poor concept because you're just referring to what is no longer here. It used to be Cold War, now it's not. We should have called this the hegemonic era, but it's not good for marketing, I guess. But this is why I think the current era has to be defined as the end of unipolarity and transition to multipolarity. If you see it like this, the US could have some strategic clarity. Again, it would be good for America and good for the world. How US in relative decline, how does it readjust with the rest of the world? How can we live with the Chinese as a equal in a way that's mitigates the threats or challenges and maximize the benefits? But these are not the talks we're having. Instead, we're talking about communism and the freedom-loving peoples, and it's just like one long Coca-Cola commercial. It's very strange, and we're missing the same here in Europe. I don't want to. It's too popular in Europe to bash the Americans, but here I think it's even worse because we hedged our wagon to the United States. This was going to be collective empire, collective hegemony, and in the multipolar world, you see the US drifting in other directions, having different priorities. So what are the Europeans doing? Instead of diversifying their economic connectivity, ending this militarized division of Europe, what do? Well, we try to increase our own stock value in America by, being even more submissive, even more obedient, hoping that Americans will still value us as an ally and, bump up us in the rank of priorities. So, a former hegemon will still think we're a priority. I mean, the whole thing is quite insane. And as you said, the different Europeans have different interests. We know the EU is not pursuing the national interest of its members anymore. So it is complete chaos. And in this chaos, I think they're trying to grab onto the Russian boogeyman as a way to pull together consensus. But again, this is a consensus which is further undermining our national interest. Again, remilitarizing the dividing lines of Europe and cutting our own economies down in size by cutting ourselves off their energy in the huge Russian market. So I don't know. I'm very frustrated by Europe, and it's yes, little reason to optimism. But you did mention the Ukraine war seemingly coming to an end, and I see this on the battlefield. You see the economy not doing well. Also, the internal cohesion is not great. You hear more Ukrainian voices recognizing that it's coming to an end. Ukrainians, also high-ranking Ukrainians, are starting to recognize that perhaps the NATO countries weren't there to help, but to use the Ukrainians for, their manpower to fight Russia. So things are starting to crack. I'm not saying it will fall apart within the next few weeks or even the next 2-3 months, but we seem to be entering the end game here. So if we lose this war, NATO loses this war, which was, many people hoped this would revive the hegemonic era. Now it fears that it would break the golden era. I think it was a Polish president who said it, that if we lose the war in Ukraine, it will end the golden era of the West. What do you think would happen? What will be the direct consequence? Not if, but when we lose the war in Ukraine?
I'm afraid that the way that is shaping up here in the United States is that Europe has very little to offer us, and therefore can be dispensed with. Mr. Trump says, I'm going to walk away. If I don't get what I want in Ukraine, well, then I will walk away, and it's a European problem. If I were the Europeans, I would be terrified of that, not for the reason they are, which I understand. The United States, if you couldn't defeat Russia with American weapons and with American money, you're sure as hell not going to do it without American weapons and American money. That's just silly. No one takes that seriously, except perhaps the media in Europe. It's hard to tell. But this notion of walking away is supported by a transformation which has gone on now for some time, led by the conservative Republican base, that the Europeans are cheating us, that the Europeans are exploitative. It's kind of a strange rendition of economics from a kind of moralizing perspective, which used to be dismissed here as old-fashioned and not hard-headed. But you actually see it here. I'll give you a couple of examples. Mr. Trump has economic advisors. I know some of them, like Scott Bessent or Mr. Navarro and some of the others. Okay, they apparently have told him something which, if they said it in a seminar among economists, they'd be laughed out of the room. But they have said it to him that if there's a trade imbalance, in other words, if I'll pick a country, Vietnam sends $100 billion worth of cheap clothing to the United States, but only buys 40 billion worth of whatever it gets from the United, that this is a sign of cheating. Now, not only is it a sign of cheating, but it's a sign of cheating by the government of Vietnam. So when I hear this and I explain to my audiences here in America that the decision to produce clothing in Vietnam was made in many cases by American corporations moving production from China, where the wages had risen, to Vietnam, where they hadn't yet, and that therefore this was a profit-driven and profit-generating decision made by American corporations whose headquarters are in Washington down the street, that you are blaming on the Vietnamese government. That makes no sense. That's ignorant, and you're not an ignorant person. What is this? Well, I think you have to go then to the ideology. It's just They need to represent it. This is dangerous, but let me give you the example that will help people understand it. Why do we have in the United States, over recent years, a resurgence of white supremacy? I don't know if you caught the theater with Mr. Ramaphosa from South Africa visiting Mr. Trump and being shown a phony movie about white cemeteries in his country. Why would we have a resurgence? Well, the answer is that white people have suffered because they had the bulk of the jobs that were relocated out of the United States for the last 30 to 40 years. Those were high-paying, unionized, manufacturing jobs, and those had gone to white people out of the discriminatory structure of American society. So they suffered when those jobs were exported. About the same time, we had the upsurge of both black people and brown people and women in America fighting against their second-class situation in this country, which is very old and very deeply rooted. So the whites who were hurt by losing their jobs had to be witness to all kinds of special programs developed by the government trying to cope with the radicalization of black, brown, and women protesting against their political and ideological subordination. So it was childishly easy for the demagogic MAGA types to tell the white people, you have been hurt not by the profit-driven decision of your employer to pay Chinese workers instead of you. No, no, no. You have been hurt by the favoritism shown by the Democratic Party to black people, brown people, and women. And you have every right to be angry. Look at Mr. Trump dismantling the DEI programs in this country. Diversity, equality, and inclusion, what those letters. That's the game. That's how he's president. He thinks, and of course he believes all of this. His demagoguery is effective because he includes himself in the people who believe all of this stuff. He really is racially prejudiced and all of that, as are most of the people around him. So they are capable of figuring out a social problem in the United States, horrible social divisions between blacks and browns, and black and brown and white, and male and female, which are in very bad shape. My wife's a psychotherapist. I can assure you, her clients are a cross-section of Americans who are finding personally it's difficult to live in this society given the stresses, the strains, and the pressures that are not being resolved at all, and explain the vitriolic language. Listen to Mr. Trump. He is a good representative of the anger and the bitterness. Well, they see the Europeans as more weight to carry, more uselessness. We're better than them. We are more technically advanced. We have a much better military. They don't even have a decent military. It's just, And you'll see if Mr. Trump withdraws, you'll see it very quickly. Blame the loss of Ukraine on the Europeans. 100%, I guarantee it to you, because he will blame whatever happens on the designated losers. He can never criticize capital or capitalism or capitalists. That's why he cannot acknowledge that half of the stuff that comes into the US from China is coming from subsidiaries of American business there. He has to say things they all do. They stole the technology. They didn't. The Chinese made a very calculated deal. You Americans or Japanese or German or Dutch, it doesn't matter. You can come to China. You can hire our disciplined labor force for a small fraction of what you pay at home, and we will give you access to the Chinese market, which is now the largest and fastest growing market in the world. Well, I've taught in business schools. That's what we teach entrepreneurs. Go where the wages are low and the market is growing, of course. And they went to China because that's where it's happening. To turn around and then when the Chinese say, okay, we're going to give you the labor force and we're going to give you a market access, you have to share your technology. That was a deal many American corporations were happy to agree to. Happy. They could continue to develop the technology. They wouldn't have to slow down. They'd have to give what's already known anyway to the Chinese in exchange for staggering improvements in profitability, which is why so many of them went. But notice the logic. This story, if you were to tell it to the American people, they kind of know it. They really do. But it's not a story that can be told. You know, it's like our sex lives. We all kind of know what that's about, but we have an agreement not to discuss this. So we talk instead about the Chinese stealing technology. Fantastic. Plays right in to the notion of evil and bad and communist and all the rest of it. And so you don't have to really think about what you're doing or why you're doing it. And of course, you can't stop it. That's the problem. You can't stop the process because you cannot allow yourself to think about it in a reasonable way.
There's a really fascinating article I would recommend, written by Edward Luttwak back in 1994. It's called "Why Fascism is the Wave of the Future," and it is interesting because the point of departure is, the neoliberal era, which really took off throughout the 80s and then in the early 90s, instead of beginning to calm it down and restoring some social responsibility of the state, like preventing, key jobs from leaving. Ensuring that capital was, still harmonized with the interest of labor. All of this went out the window, and he said with this globalized market and new technologies coming, the Gesellschaft would effectively tear away the Gemeinschaft. So anyways, his whole point was, that the government's no longer, the US government didn't try to prevent the export of its key manufacturing jobs, and under the neoliberal dogma, the maximizing market efficiency meant that the economy would be driven, and again, the society was a mere appendage, nothing to be taken into account. So this was quite predictable. Well, what would happen if you let the main companies just export any job they want, or they have no more loyalties effectively to the society where they reside, and you would end up in a situation where the West Coast and East Coast of America, where the tech and finance all are, they would thrive on the globalization. As you said, they can export, the manufacturing jobs to the cheapest possible place, while the Americans working in industry, they would not only end up in lower paid jobs, lower skilled jobs, not just the money, but also the social standing. If you make a car, this is part of the whole American culture, and now you're going to stand in the, at Kmart at the checkout. It's not the same. So you're destroying people's pride, their economy, and the whole idea that humans are not just numbers, they're actual people. So, no, I very much agree. You have a huge complexity, and instead of revisiting the past 40 years of neoliberal economics, the Chinese took our jobs. They stole our technologies. I mean, all this nonsense, which doesn't make any sense, but it does sell much better than discussing the difficulties and complexities of capitalism, and indeed human nature, which can't really be resolved. So, anyways,
let me
yeah,
let me add one dimension here. That here's the irony of it all. It is the struggle between capital and labor. Yanis Varoufakis says this, and it's very important. He's right. It is the struggle between capital and labor. It is the struggle, it is Marx's class struggle that in the end is shaping all of this. What happened in the United States in this last century begins and is always driven by the stunning reality of the 1930s. Europeans somehow, and when I meet with them, they either don't know the history or they don't give it the weight they ought to. In the 1930s, when capitalism globally collapses in 1929, and we have the horror of everything that unfolded in the 30s, the American working class lurched to the left. It joined in huge numbers trade unions. It was the greatest unionization in American history. Never had anything like it before, and have never had anything like it since. You ended up with a third of the labor force in unions, and they were powerful unions in all the basic industries. The CIO, it was called. And you had hundreds of thousands of people joining two large socialist parties and one large communist party. And they were powerful enough, all working together, the socialists, the communists, and the labor unions. Despite all their disagreements and troubles, they worked together. And they were incredible. They went to the president and they basically said, you have to do something in this Great Depression. You really have to do something, or else there's going to be a revolution here. And Roosevelt, the president, a centrist Democrat, rather like, Bill Clinton or someone like that, understood that he was talking to his voters. And the communists didn't hesitate. They said, you either give us something or we'll vote you right out of here. You'll be gone. Because you have to be better than the Republicans or else we have no reason. And we'll make our own party. So he gave them, in very short time, the Social Security system. We had never had that in this country, a state pension. A minimum wage that was decent. We never had that before. An unemployment program. If you lose your job, you immediately get money for a year or two. And finally, public employment, 15 million jobs. And all of this cost a fortune. And the government had no money because it was a depression. And businesses weren't paying taxes, consumers weren't paying taxes, and workers were out of work and paying no taxes. So he had to go to the rich, which he did. He went big taxes and big borrowing. And he borrowed to take care of the mass of people, to give them a check for nothing because they were old or they were unemployed. It's capitalism's anathema. It is. And when the war is over and the president who did this is dead and the Nazis are defeated, there has been one objective hammered home in the ruling class of this country. Undo the New Deal. Cancel all of it. Not just get rid of the public employment, which they did. But drop the minimum wage so it becomes meaningless through inflation. Do the same with Social Security. Do this. That's all they've been doing. And they trained the government to be the government that does nothing. That it's the old laissez-faire. Don't intervene. Don't. Well, of course, they meant don't do anything leftist. They had a long list of what the government should do for them, most of which is the Cold War and gets justified around that. But that's why the ruling class was able to say, now we want to be neoliberal. We want you to get rid of tariffs and because we're the number one country, we can do the best. But it comes out of the class struggle and the very myopic inability that we started today, not able to see, is because your ability to reason has been overwhelmed by the ideological crusade that has governed American culture since 1945.
But it doesn't even have to be that ideological. Back in the, I think it was 1817 or 20, David Ricardo, one of the, pillars of economic liberalism, he made the observation which had surprised him, that with every technological innovation which increases productivity, the vast majority of the gains would go to capital owner. And he made the point that sometimes even the labor would actually be weakened, given that the relative power between capital and labor would shift. And again, this is one of the liberal economists, but also from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, they also recognize that the development or emergence of the rent seeker would also be destructive and not good. But these days, when you talk about left and right and capitalism, it's all following this very strange political dogmas, which doesn't really have that much empirical or substance behind it. So it's very strange to watch.
It is, I think, as many people feel, a very strange time in which the disconnect between what our leaders are talking about and our felt sense of what's unfolding are so disconnected that you really kind of wonder where you are and how to interpret what's going on. And you know what that does? It makes programs like yours all the more important. No, it really does. These conversations have to be had. And, you and a dozen others who are doing this are the only hope that there is a rational conversation. Look how frustrated, it's interesting that he comes up so often, but how frustrated Yanis Varoufakis, because I know you know him, how he gets often in his interviews when he looks at the reporter and he can't quite believe, really, that's what you think is going on. And he has to be polite, but.
Well, on that very flattering note, we can end it there. So thank you again. I always love speaking with you. So
Same here.
Have a good day.
And I meant it too. I really appreciate what you do. I think it's an enormously valuable contribution.
Well, thanks again. I appreciate it.